Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I've made a couple of videos about my recent trip to Massachusetts. Last week I talked about one of the weekends in Boston, and today I want to tell you about my other weekend in the area, not to visit Steve, but instead to celebrate a special time with my son, Abe. On this weekend, I had traveled into Boston on a commercial bus line, which is not my favorite way to travel, mostly because reading on buses makes me a bit motion sick. I did have an audiobook all lined up for the trip, but I ended up conking out instead and staying asleep for most of the trip from Amherst. I woke only when we were nearing Boston, and the late afternoon urban traffic made the bus even more stop and go. But I survived, and when we pulled into Boston South Station, my son was there with smiles and hugs, offering to carry my bag, which was lovely because even though I have healed extremely well from my shoulder surgery, that arm gets a little tired and a little sore if I carry heavy bags for too long. And I had acquired a few too many books on my trip to Amherst. Abe and I took the subway, that is the T, back to his neighborhood and took the very cool walking path from his local T station to the house where he lives. I'd come to see Abe for three reasons this time. One is the obvious one of loving to see him whenever it's possible for the two of us to get together. But next, we were both celebrating birthdays that week. And third, Abe was performing at the New England Folk Festival, held at a community center and nearby conference hotel slightly outside of Boston. Although Abe's formal work is as a theater sound engineer, he's basically equally committed to his life as a musician, as are his two apartment mates. Their flat is on the second floor of a house owned by someone quite active in the Boston folk community. Abe performs with several different groups, but one of them is named after the place where they live. In addition to Abe, his roommates, and me staying at their apartment that weekend, two other friends from out of town were also visiting. Also, there was this lovely cat that lives with them. One morning, I awoke to her cuddled up right beside me. The three housemates often host musicians at their house for folk music jams, and sometimes they're the backup group for a rotating set of other folk musicians. I think it started with these impromptu jams in their living room, but now that band has expanded. The weekend I was there, they performed at the folk festival for a huge gymnasium full of contra dancers, and one of Abe's other bands, a duo, played a full concert of songs that they had just recently recorded for an album. They also played with a larger group for an English country dance. Although I took quite a bit of footage at the folk festival, I'm actually not going to share any of it since it's full of strangers, and I don't want to post them online. But it was a wonderful weekend, and one of the things about a festival like the New England Folk Festival is that people come from a wide range of traditions, from American contra dance, open to all attendees and always quite relaxed and playful, to more formal English country dance, to Morris dance teams, from Scottish and Irish music to the music of Appalachia and Maine, from groups performing dances from Thailand, from various countries in Africa, from India, etc. The best part was that the musicians and dancers and other attendees were having so much fun playing music together and dancing together. As a non-musician with two left feet, I loved getting to watch and to chat with folks. At the end of the festival, as we were celebrating together, Abe made delicious egg creams for assembled housemates and friends. For those of you unfamiliar with egg creams, let me explain. They include neither eggs nor cream. This is a drink that became popular during the late 19th century in soda shops owned by Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants from New York City. Basically, it's a glass partially filled with milk, dairy or non-dairy, then sweetened, often with chocolate syrup, but not always, and topped off with seltzer or carbonated water. Abe and his roommates make them relatively frequently and have played around with different types of syrups and sweeteners, as well as different flavors of seltzer. I'm no scientist, but there's something about the proteins in milk that traps the gas from the seltzer, I think, making it have quite a head on top. The drink feels much thicker than you'd expect, creamy, but not quite to the level of a milkshake. I loved Abe and Friends' creative versions so much that when I got home, I pulled out the rose syrup from our old cocktail shelf and added it to some milk, and then topped it with guava-flavored seltzer I had just acquired at the grocery store. Delicious, but definitely not traditional. One of the days I was at Abe's place was a work day for him, and together we walked towards his workplace, stopping on the way for bagels, which we ate sitting outside in the little garden outside his theater. I got to meet some of his workmates, which was just lovely. And then I headed down to Harvard Square, full of bookshops, starting with the incredible Harvard Bookstore, which is not owned by the university at all, with its amazing new books on the first floor and basement full of used books below. In fact, I found a used book or two to drag home with me, which I'll talk about in a future video. I then went to the Grolier, a tiny but astonishingly well-stocked poetry bookstore I used to visit regularly back in the late 1980s. Actually, I visited the Harvard bookstore regularly back then too. These are not new stores by any means. Anyway, the Grolier had a sign on the door saying that the proprietor would be back in a moment, but I checked several times and it was never open, sadly. Instead, I hung out at the bookstore section in the Harvard Coop, a huge bookstore with tons of Harvard sweatshirts and the like, a section of school books ordered for classes and arranged by course numbers, and also a rather large standard bookstore that, at least recently, was run by Barnes & Noble. My favorite part of the standard bookstore section was the very long series of shelves with books written by Harvard professors and graduates. Very cool. There are several other bookstores in Harvard Square and fairly nearby. One is a romance bookstore. While I didn't visit the store this day, I did check them out last time I was in the area. So let me show you some pictures of that. The most interesting bookstore I went to on this trip was Million Year Picnic. Apparently this is one of the great comic book stores in the country, at least for people who know what they're seeing. Things are not rigorously organized, but they fill every nook and cranny in the small basement shop. It reminded me of going in the private archives of various organizations and seeing papers that had never been organized. Apparently, for people in the know, such as my son's great friend Jules, this store is the place to run across amazing things you might never imagine seeing. Before I actually went in the store, I sent a Voxer message to Steve Donahue, asking him for his order. And then, list in hand, I shimmied through the tight aisles until I got to the desk, blushed, and said I was clueless in the comic shop, but had a shopping list and would love some help. The older man behind the counter gave me a big smile and was incredibly kind as he tried to help me find them, but no luck. Before I left, though, he rattled off perhaps a dozen other comic shops in the greater Boston area, including a mainstream one in Harvard Square, and a small independent one very close to the neighborhood where my son lives. So, before the end of the day, when I met back up with Abe, I had been to my first 3 comic shops. And while all 3 had staff members who were unbelievably welcoming of this old newbie, none of them had the comics that Steve had requested. By the end of my time in Massachusetts, more than a week later, I had visited 6 shops and eventually found all 4 of the volumes on my list. Are they called volumes or editions, maybe? Before I left Harvard Square, I visited the beautiful campus of Harvard and walked through the freshman yard where most first-year undergraduates live in some of the earliest university buildings. I also ogled the gorgeous Widener Library, waved at Emerson Hall, the philosophy department named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I would visit later in my trip, and stepped into the entrance of Seaver Hall, where the smallest whisper made into the bricks of one side of the curve surrounding the front door can be heard on the opposite side of the arch. After my adventures in the Boston area with Abe, I traveled to a couple of historic towns nearby, which I plan to talk about in a video soon. Thanks for joining me for this somewhat random little video. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.